Okay, the next bit of housekeeping is about muting phones. You can either do it on your own or you can use on your own phone, or you can use a *6 to mute and then a *7 to unmute when it's time for questions. So *6, folks, thank you. Except for Rebekah, and so we are happy to have with us today Rebekah King, Policy Associate at the National Housing Conference, to make sense for us of what's happening in Washington related to the budget, this year's budget we're still in, FY17, and next year's budget, which the fiscal year starts October 1. Rebekah, take it away.
Well, make sense seems like a lofty goal, but I'll at least describe to you what's happening here, and that was a good kind of intro. So we are in FY 2017, and we are under a continuing resolution, which expires April 28th. Now, both chambers of Congress are out on recess this week and next week, leaving them 4 days to address FY 2017 spending. Now, what we're hearing, and we're optimistic, is that appropriators will be able, Congress will be able to pass FY17 omnibus appropriations bills because a lot of the bills were negotiated by December of 2016, including THUD. And the THUD omnibus bill is good in terms of what the Senate and the House had, and they pretty much agree. So appropriators would like to just pass those bills and be done with it. And we're thinking that the Senate will use the defense bill, which the House has already passed, add the rest of the spending bills, pass it with no policy writers, and then send it back to the House for a vote. And that package would be released hopefully April 24th. There are a couple of caveats to that. That's kind of the ideal scenario. There's still a chance that different congressmen would want policy writers, which would muck up the process. And even if this plan goes forward, we still anticipate at least a short-term CR for like a few days or a week so that they can get the bills passed. That being said, it could still play out any number of ways with a full-term CR or a mix of an omnibus and continuing resolutions for different agencies where there might be disagreement. Again, we're hoping THUD is not in that mix. But we're just hoping that they'll pass the bills they've already negotiated. Now, President Trump did request $18 billion in cuts for the remainder of FY 2017. We actually think that's being mostly ignored on the Hill right now because of the late stage we're in with appropriations. But that's good for housing programs. So we'll see what happens there. And I also wanted to touch on FY 2018 because that's going to be here before we know it. And President Trump has already unveiled a skinny budget, which outlined $6 billion in cuts for HUD programs. It would cut vouchers, public housing, project-based rental assistance, Section 202, and other housing programs. It would also, his proposal would eliminate home, CDBG, Community Development Block Grant, SHOP program, and choice neighborhoods completely. It would also cut USDA Rural Housing Service. It would eliminate Community Development Financial Institutions Fund. It would eliminate funding for NeighborWorks, weatherization assistance programs, and it would cut the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, and I believe eliminate the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. So here in Washington, all of us advocates have been deeply alarmed by the skinny budget, and appropriators are waiting to see his full budget in May, mid-May, I believe, before they start the FY18 appropriations process. That's a lot later than normal. So it puts, again, we're going to be under a time crunch for full appropriations bills. FY18 is also going to be challenging because regardless of the president's budget, sequestration comes back in 2018. So HUD programs are looking at cuts already. So we are telling legislators to keep parity between defense and non-defense and to address the caps so that we don't have sequester in FY 2018. Housing programs are well below 2010 funding levels. We've been cut almost every year. And if sequestration goes into effect in 2018, non-defense discretionary programs would fall by $14 billion. So HUD would definitely see cuts. So we're just really hoping folks can tell their legislators, their congressmen, senators to address the caps, lift the caps, and keep parity between defense and non-defense. A lot of what we've been hearing is that congressmen, senators, they understand the importance of a lot of the programs that President Trump proposed to cut or eliminate, which is great, but there's less discussion about raising the caps. So we're pretty concerned about FY 2018 budget and anticipate it's going to be a pretty ugly fight. So I'm going to pause there. That was a lot of appropriations information and see if there's any questions.
Rebekah, also, this is Cindy. I'll start by asking you to lay out the process a little bit from here going forward to the end of September. You know, what's the timing for even in a normal year or, you know, what you see happening in terms of, somebody put us on hold, in terms of, you know, the Appropriations Committee work and then the full House and Senate.
Sure.
Come off.
Cindy, it's Joyce. I'm going to go in and see if I can.
Thanks.
So, as I mentioned, for FY 18, we are already late in terms of starting the appropriations process. What we are hearing is that appropriators hope to start the typical hearings they have on the different agency spending budgets in May and get to some legislation, some markups by July, and then passing bills in September after the August recess. That's a pretty optimistic timeline given all the things going on federally, but we are anticipating hearings in May and starting to see some legislation by July is the hope.
I'm sorry about all this. I think, Joyce, maybe mute all the lines and
I'm trying to get
you.
Yeah, no, I'm trying to get in. I'm not there yet. Sorry, everyone.
Sorry,
let's
minute. So, Rebekah, after she mutes all the lines, you might need to hit *7.
Okay, I'm doing it now.
Okay.
The conference has been muted.
Okay, Rebekah, are you back? *7.
I'm back.
Okay, great. I hear you. You hear me? Good.
Yeah.
So you're talking about hearings in May and markups that are reported out in July. Did I get that right? And
yes.
Okay. And then so the best time for advocacy then, like maybe talk about when they're in session and when they're home, because it's easier to reach them when they're home.
Right. So they're in recess now. Actually, let me just double check. They should be back. Well, they'll be back April 24th for a while. Their biggest recess is in August, so they'll be out for the whole month. Let me just pull up. And they'll also have a brief recess at the end of May and over the July 4th and Labor Day holidays.
That's right. The week following the week of Memorial Day.
Yes, they will be home
as I recall.
the week of Memorial Day, and then they will be home over July 4th week.
Okay. But don't wait, right? Don't wait.
Right. And that's exactly right. What we've been told is that, especially for Republican offices, they really need to hear from the constituents using these programs, benefiting from these programs, about why housing is so important. And I would urge folks to, while I know different agencies and organizations have maybe specific programs that are their priorities, if we just start defending our own program, our own priority, we're all going to lose. because they are looking for programs to get rid of, which is just going to hurt affordable housing overall. So it's really we need to hold the line on all affordable housing funding so that we can move the needle on meeting the crisis. So I would encourage folks to keep that context in mind. But yes, talk to them often, talk to them early. And I'm happy to share some resources. There's some groups here, the Non-Defense Discretionary United Coalition, which is focused on the caps, the sequestration issue I mentioned. And then the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding has put out a great report and some advocacy resources that folks might find helpful.
That's really helpful, Rebekah. And so just really to emphasize your point about talking about your program, but also the broader context. So, for example, if you serve people who are experiencing homelessness, the McKinney-Vento money is really important. But if we lose CDBG and home, we're not going to be developing more affordable homes. And so people can't move out of shelter. I mean, one of the prime reasons people are homeless is because there's not enough affordable housing. So, the big picture is really important, helping them to connect the dots, helping them understand the thousands of people on waiting lists for public housing, housing choice vouchers, and even local programs, whether they're tax credit developments or other types of homes in your community. This is the time to talk big picture. So I'll stop talking now and open it up to any other questions. It's *7 to unmute your line. I know we have a couple of people on from USDA. Rebekah, have you paid much attention to the rural housing programs?
Yes, somewhat. USDA is a little bit in an interesting place right now because Secretary nominee Perdue hasn't been confirmed yet. He should be confirmed the week of April 24th, hopefully on April 24th, but schedules can change slightly. So there's not someone kind of advocating in the administration for rural programs right now, including rural development and the Rural Housing Service. Again, President Trump's skinny budget did propose cuts to the Rural Housing Service, to rural development, but he didn't detail what those cuts would be. So that will be a point of concern and interest in the full budget when it comes out in May.
And I think as far as FY17, it was pretty much level funded in the agriculture bill?
Yes, they were level funded, and I was in a discussion with some rural preservation folks, and I'm trying to remember if it was FY16 approps or FY17 approps where they were able to get a plus up for some of the rural rental voucher and assistance funds so that they were in a better place there.
Okay, great. Again, I'll pause and let other people ask questions, *7 to unmute your call. But then I have a couple of other questions for you. Okay, have you also been following the conversations around two things, tax reform? Tax reform and the low-income housing tax credit are related, but they're two different aspects of it. So have you been looking at the low-income housing tax credit issue?
Yes, and I can give a brief overview of that legislation now, if that...
Sure, yeah, that'd be great.
So tax reform is being discussed. I'll start there in brief. And that's really all there is to say about that. The President has talked about wanting to do tax reform. There's certainly congressional interest in doing that, but there's some disagreement about kind of pretty significant provisions. So it's unclear if they're going to really focus on comprehensive corporate tax reform, if they're going to instead pursue kind of just across-the-board tax cuts similar to the Bush-era tax cuts, or some hybrid in between. So that really remains to be seen. They did talk about a pretty ambitious timeline of doing this by August, but Hill staff tell us that's probably just not feasible if it's comprehensive tax reform. So it would be a next year action item. But tax reform would impact the low-income housing tax credit. And so the action campaign, the folks focused on advocacy just around the tax credit are following tax reform closely so they can protect the program. They've also been really active, and NHC is part of this campaign, working with Senator Maria Cantwell from Washington on legislation. And so on March 7th, Senator Cantwell and Senate Finance Committee Chairman Orrin Hatch introduced the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act of 2017. So it's a comprehensive bill to expand and strengthen the low-income housing tax credit. They introduced a very similar bill in 2016. So they've made a few changes, but it's pretty much the same bill. It would increase housing credit authority by 50%. It would also provide additional flexibility to states, would make the financing more predictable. It would facilitate housing credit development in rural and Native American markets, which are usually more challenging. It would increase the credit's ability to serve extremely low-income tenants, and it would also support the preservation of existing affordable housing. A couple kind of more specific things I want to highlight about the bill. It would allow income averaging. So the overall average for a tax credit property would remain 60% of area median income. But this legislation would allow for you to serve households up to 80% of area median income, so you could use that increased rent revenue to cross-subsidize and then have units going down to 50 or 40% of AMI without needing additional subsidy, as long, again, as your overall average was 60% of area median income. So we think that's a pretty exciting provision in terms of serving lower incomes with the credit without needing vouchers or project-based rental assistance. And I shared with Cindy and folks, NHC did a fact sheet kind of describing this provision and what it could look like for developments. Another thing I want to highlight, it would support a permanent 4% rate when using the credit with multifamily housing bonds, so that would be helpful as well. And I have information on all the specific provisions. If anyone has questions, I'm happy to run through those and share more detail about that. I also want to mention that this year, unlike in 2016, we actually have companion legislation in the House. On March 22nd, Representative Pat Teaberry and Richard Neal introduced the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act in the House. It includes almost all of the provisions in the Senate bill. It does not include the expansion measure, which is unfortunate, but they didn't think they could get a lot of bipartisan co-sponsors if they included it right now. But the Teaberry and Neal are not opposed to the expansion, so the hope is that in conference that we could add that 50% into the final bill. And there's pretty good Republican support in the House, which is also welcome. So a lot of optimism that this can really move, hopefully soon, or definitely over the next year, that there's growing support for improving the credit. So I will stop there.
Great, thank you. Questions about low-income housing tax credit legislation? *7 to unmute your line. Quiet group today.
Where can information on those bills be found?
So I will send Cindy and Joyce links to share with you. The Action Campaign has a number of resources with a section-by-section summary and the specific language actually in the bill. But their website is full of good resources on the legislation.
I also wanted to add, this is Joyce from the Housing Alliance, that we're really pleased to get both Representative Kelly and Representative Meehan, Republicans from Pennsylvania, were original co-sponsors of the Teaberry bill in the House. We've been trying also, for folks on the call, I think I heard Chris Cassidy, trying to get and have asked Representative Dent, Representative Costello, I think I heard folks from Chester County, other Republicans on board as well. So if anyone wants additional information, you can call me over the next couple days, but we can send out the information from Dave Gasson. But it would be great to get other folks Republicans from Pennsylvania to sign on.
Absolutely, Joyce. Thank you, and not just the ones that Joyce mentioned, although they're very important, and but all of them. And on the Senate side, I know that Senator Casey is interested. We would love to have Senator Toomey on. We've been talking about the best way to advocate with our congressional delegation, whether it's about the tax credit bill or the budget or any other approach to expanding affordable homes, and trying to meet with them when they're home on recess is great. If you can't do that and you can get to D.C. or calling their office is good. I think the best thing that you can do when they're home on recess is try to get them out to your site to see what your buildings look like, to see what your programs look like, so that they can make the connection. Budgets are big documents with lots of programs and lots of numbers. And too often the conversation comes down to how much do we need to cut to make ends meet, and not very often how much do we need to raise. But at any rate, it's a bottom line. How do we make it all add up? What we need to do as people who work in this world, in the housing world, is put the human face on it, but also show them the success, show them how important it is for your community, because after all, for example, a tax credit development is not just important for the 30 households who will live there. It's important for the whole community. It's important if you have renovated a long vacant property. It's important because maybe you're taking people off of waiting lists who have been on waiting lists for years. It's important because maybe you're now freeing up space in the homeless shelter for others who unfortunately are experiencing homelessness. And so it's really important to get them to see what this money buys and to see how important it is for the local economy, for the contractors, for the suppliers, really connect the dots for them. So that's my push on advocacy. But yes, getting more co-sponsors on the bills and certainly getting their support as they move. And speaking of as they move, have you heard talk, Rebekah, about movement on either the T-Berry-Neal or Cantwell-Hatch bill?
So the Action Campaign is actively meeting with offices to get more folks to sign on to the bills now that they've both been introduced. I think part of the strategy here is waiting to see what's going to happen with tax reform and if there's a way to fold these bills into that activity. Depending on what that looks like, that might be easier in certain scenarios than others. Straight tax cuts, I think they're really hopeful they could get this in. But in terms of more action, I think they're still trying to get more support before moving forward. I do think there's also some optimism that given other things that have happened in terms of like the healthcare repeal, Republicans might be happy to have a win, some good bipartisan legislation that does some good for low-income communities. So there's good energy, but not really a sense of a timeline.
Okay, great, thank you. Star 7, if you have a question or comment.
This is Ben Hooper. I wanted to go back to the tax credit legislation. Do we know what the cost scoring is on the Senate bill that has the expansion?
That's a great question, and I don't know. Let me check my notes really quick.
Then while Rebecca's checking her notes, do you want to explain to folks on the call what cost scoring is?
My very general understanding is just the impact on the budget, and I'm curious as I get excited about the possibilities of its passing.
So my computer is being challenging. I can say that I do think that was part of the thinking in the House. Honestly, this is just me personally. I haven't heard this from folks working more closely with the legislation, but they didn't include the expansion, and so the changes themselves, most of them shouldn't score. They should not have a cost. Making the 4% rate permanent would have a cost, but most of the other changes are strictly streamlining efficiency, making the program work better. So there shouldn't be a real cost there. It's part of why I think it's getting some really good support because they're just really common sense changes. So the expansion would score, but everything else, except for making the 4% rate permanent, shouldn't score.
Thank you.
One other thing that we have focused on as we do our advocacy, federal advocacy, is infrastructure and making sure that housing and community development are recognized as part of the nation's infrastructure. Have you heard anything more about an infrastructure bill?
So we heard what I'm sure most folks heard when HUD Secretary Carson was doing his listening tour visit to Dallas and Fort Worth, Texas, last week, 2 weeks ago. No, that's not right. I'm sorry. He was speaking at the Low-Income Housing Coalition's conference here in Washington last week, and he said that President Trump understands housing is an important part of our country's infrastructure and that housing would be part of any infrastructure package that the administration proposes. So that's great to hear. The concerning thing about his remarks in terms of housing as infrastructure was essentially using the infrastructure package as replacement funding for the cuts the president has proposed. So I would caution folks. I think NHC, like many of you, are certainly advocating and saying that housing is infrastructure because it is, but that one-time funding in this bill is not the way to fund housing programs. Communities need predictable funding so they can plan. When you're talking about real estate, it takes more than a couple of days to put those things together, so you need to know the funding's going to be there. So we are now, with those remarks, trying to carefully discuss infrastructure. An additional plus-up in funding would be great, but in terms of funding federal housing that way, not a good idea.
Right, and so far there is no infrastructure bill, or I guess the Democrats had offered a package, but is there a Republican infrastructure bill?
So Democrats have offered a package. There is not a Republican version yet. There's a lot of, I would say, maybe not a lot, but there is disagreement within the Republican Party in terms of how you would structure the infrastructure bill. Would it be additional federal spending? Would you require offsets? Would it just be tax breaks to generate some public-private partnerships? So there's less consensus on the Republican side about what they would propose or what they would support coming from the White House.
Okay. Thank you. Any last questions or thoughts for Rebecca? Star 7 to unmute your line.
Hello, this is David Hunter.
Hi, David.
Hey, just a question for Rebecca. I had heard that Maxine Waters did a Dear Colleague letter, and I wonder if you've seen that. I heard some details about it on the Novogradek's Tax Credit Tuesday podcast yesterday, but I'm just wondering if you've seen it and if it sounds very detailed. I'm just wondering if it aligns with what you've seen elsewhere.
Are you familiar with that one, Rebecca? Are you muted?
Oh, sorry, I am muted. I cannot speak to her specifically. I have actually pulled up. There's a large number of Dear Colleague letters floating around. I'm trying to see if I have the one from Waters in my list.
Okay.
But I will find it and share it.
Thank you. That'd be great. This one had, I think, 96 signatures on it.
Well,
okay.
From members.
David, what was it specifically directed at?
Well, it was HUD budget as well as tax reform. So it sounded quite comprehensive.
Okay.
She also has, she has also sponsored a Housing for Vulnerable Populations Dear Colleague letter. I'm not sure how many folks have signed on to that, but it was full funding for public housing, full funding for vouchers, full funding for PBRA, 202, and 811.
That sounds like it could be the same one, although it doesn't speak to tax credits, does it?
No, it doesn't. So I will see if there's another. She's also helped sponsor the Community Development Block Grant letter, so there may be yet another one out there. But I will find it and get back to you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Anything else? All right, great. Thank you so much, Rebekah. Very helpful. We certainly will keep in touch with you. And let us know even between these monthly calls as things develop. We look forward to hearing from you.
Definitely, we'll do that.
All right, so we will turn stateside now, where it's also budget season. And our fiscal year, of course, ends June 30th, which means there's supposed to be a budget in place June 30th. I think I've seen that once in the time that I've been at Housing Alliance. But it could happen. The process has started. The process officially starts with the release of the governor's budget in early February. But given that the governor is of the minority party in the legislature, that didn't go very far. The House Republicans introduced their budget bill just a week ago, I believe it was, last Monday. I've been traveling a lot, sort of lost track of the days, but I think it was April 3rd. It was introduced in the morning, passed out of appropriations in the afternoon, and passed out of the full House on Tuesday. But everybody sort of understands that while it was not subject to public deliberation, that it's really a starting point because everybody expects the Senate to make changes to it, and this is really where the conversation starts. However, there were, at least in some previous years, what I've seen is that the House Republican Appropriations chair, it's his bill, simply takes last year's budget, puts it into the bill, and again, just gets the ball rolling. They didn't actually do that this year. They made some changes which were not good for us in terms of the little bit of housing and community development money that is in the state budget. So there are 3 line items, really, that we follow. Homeless assistance and the Human Services Development Fund, separate from the block grant, just a line item for the Human Services Development Fund. At the Department of Human Services, both receive small cuts in, again, the proposal that's working its way through it, which is House Bill 218. So currently, homeless assistance is funded at $18.5 million. It was level funded in the governor's proposal, but brought down to $15.7 in House Bill 218. Human Services Development Fund is currently at $13.5 million, again level funded in the governor's proposal, but brought down to $11.4 in the bill that is now moving. And before I move on to Keystone Communities, I just want to comment that when it's budget season, people tend to be very myopic in terms of comparing a current proposal to either the current year's funding, last year's funding. And so cuts, because we rarely see increases, cuts may look small until you look back a few years. So, again, homeless assistance, which is currently at 18.5, in 2011-12 was at 20.5. The year before that, it was at 22.8. Back before the recession, in 2008-9, or I guess that was the first year of the recession, it was at 26.6. And so it has, while it was flat funded for a number of years, there has been a decline. And the same thing for the Human Services Development Fund, which back in 2008-9 was at $34 million, is now at 13.5, and again slated for a small cut. Keystone Communities is at the Department of Community and Economic Development. This is the program that largely, or most of it, funds the Main Street, Elm Street, Keystone Opportunity Zone programs. A small piece of it goes to accessible housing, which is home modifications for people with disabilities. And a small piece goes to community revitalization. This is the program that was formed when 2 or 3, depending on how you look at it, line items were combined. New Communities, which was Elm Street, Main Street, KOZ, and accessible housing, and the Housing Redevelopment Assistance Program was basically zeroed out of the budget. So, again, back when those 3 programs existed in 2008-9, they totaled $55 million. By the time they were the year before the 3 line items were eliminated, they totaled close to $28 million. The first year of Keystone Communities, it was at $12 million, and has worked its way down to a little under $6.5 million. Now, I will say that last year there was a bump up to $12.5 million. Some of that money may have been earmarked for a particular program, but at any rate, it's back down in both the governor's budget and House Bill 218 to $6.36 million. So, not a whole lot of money out there to support community and economic community revitalization. I will say that there are a couple of other programs that are not general fund programs, and so they don't appear in the budget bill. We're going to talk in a few minutes about the Neighborhood Assistance Program, which is a tax credit, and so that's part of the revenue code, and that is at $18 million, stays at $18 million until at some point the revenue code, the tax code, is amended. The State Housing Trust Fund FAIR is not a general fund item, so that we do not have to go through appropriations every year. It is a sort of a changing revenue level depending on a couple of different formulas, but I just want to point out that that money is there, and in fact, at tomorrow's PHFA board meeting, they will be announcing the first awards with the Realty Transfer Tax money, about $12 million worth, so we're pretty excited about that. But back to the budget, total general fund spending proposed for housing and community housing and community development is, boy, I added that up wrong. So let me do some quick adding in my head, 12, 27, $33 million. Again, homelessness assistance, Human Services Development Fund, Keystone Communities. So the process is now in the Senate, has to go through the Appropriations Committee, needs a floor vote, goes back to the House because they're going to amend it. But really, the way the budget is done is leadership gets together behind closed doors. Generally, a 5-party discussion, House and Senate, Republican, Democrat, and the governor's office. I have been told, you may have heard me say on this call before, that part of the way leadership decides what programs to keep and what to cut is they literally count up the requests they have received from members of their caucus. So that doesn't mean that we call the majority leader in the House or the Senate. It means that we reach out to our local representatives and senators. Again, invite them out to see what you're doing. Make sure they know of the importance of your work in the communities and that it can't happen without this money, and ask them to contact their leadership to support, to increase funding for these programs in the state budget. Let me pause there and take questions on the state budget. And then, I'm sorry. I will also mention that there has been talk about reducing tax credits. The state offers a lot of tax credits. I think I totaled up, I did a rough estimate of somewhere in the neighborhood of $250 million worth of tax credits available from a variety of programs, the largest of which is the Education Improvement Tax Credit. There's another, I think it's called Opportunity Scholarship Tax Credit, something like that. We've got the Film Tax Credit. We've got a lot of tax credits to attract businesses to Pennsylvania. A much smaller one at $18 million is the Neighborhood Assistance Tax Credit Program. In Governor Wolf's address, he proposed somehow merging all the tax credits. I'm not quite sure. I think nobody's quite sure how that would happen, and reducing them by about $100 million. I think his figure was from I don't know, maybe larger than what I totaled up, but reducing them from about $400 million to $300 million. That got a lot of pushback at the Capitol, and yet when the House budget came out last week, there was also talk about maybe a $25 million cut in tax credits, but protecting the education tax credits, which again are like the largest chunk of the state tax credits out there. So it's not in the budget bill because tax credits don't appear in the budget bill, but that is the talk. And I just got an email asking if there's a summary of what I'm explaining in terms of House Bill 218, the budget. I do have a chart that I think we have on our website, but we can also send it around to people who are on the call. And anyway, so there is talk about reducing tax credits. So again, the advocacy is just so important at this time in mid-April, going into May. They are home on recess now. They come back on the 18th. As far as the state, the General Assembly, the State House and Senate go, they are usually here in Harrisburg Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. They're back in their districts Thursday and Friday and over the weekend. And in May, they're only in Harrisburg for 6 days, the 8th, 9th, 10th, the 22nd, 3rd, and 4th. June is a little busier because of the budget. So, again, call your district office, invite them out, or go down to see them and talk to them. Let me stop and see if you have questions about the state budget. *7 to unmute.
Cindy, I just had one. It's Joyce. Quick question. Joe and I have been back and forth. What's the homeless assistance number? Is it 18.5?
Currently at 18.5. The House bill is proposing 15.7. 15 as in 15.7.
Thanks.
Yep. Okay. Let me go right into the neighborhood assistance program discussion, and then, of course, I'll open up the lines again. There are two bills to double the allocation of tax credits under neighborhood assistance from $18 million to $36 million. And I want to pause for a second and just talk a little bit about the program, because some of you may be familiar with it, but I know a lot of folks are not. The neighborhood assistance tax credit is essentially a tax credit for a charitable contribution. It's not a tax credit in the sense of low-income housing tax credits where people with money, corporations, will invest in a project and become a partner in a project. Neighborhood Assistance, NAP, grants a tax credit at different rates for corporations that make contributions to approved nonprofit organizations doing work to improve impoverished areas. And so it's open to any corporation or entity that pays corporate taxes. There's also a relatively new provision that they can sell the tax credit, so if they don't have a tax liability themselves, they can sell it to somebody else, still make the contribution. There are three divisions, you might say, of the NAP program. The basic rate tax credit for a once-and-done contribution is 55%. So a local corporation, often a bank, makes a contribution to the nonprofit. They take a credit for 55% of the value of that contribution on their state taxes. Then there are things called special program priorities. Every year, DCED publishes the list of those priorities, and they get, I believe, a 75% credit. There's also NPP, neighborhood preservation, maybe neighborhood something program, which is a 5-year or longer commitment. So 5 annual contributions, and that gets an 85% credit. But it's not just housing. I mean, obviously, we would like to promote it as a program that can be used to help housing development, to help community revitalization programs, can be used for blight remediation. It can be used for housing counseling. It can be used for other sorts of counseling. It can be used for job creation, crime prevention, after-school programs, whatever is needed in your community. And food banks also are not limited to impoverished areas, so food support. Lots of innovative, creative things you can do with this program. It was created in 1967, a national model, first of its kind, and it was at $18 million, and it has not gone up since. It was lowered for 2 years during the recession, but has not gone above that. So there is a bipartisan effort to double the rate, and the bill numbers, we've got House Bill, bear with me so I give you the right numbers, House Bill 645, and the really exciting thing is the sponsor is Representative Bernie O'Neill, who is also the chair of the House Finance Committee where the bill has been assigned. So it has not yet come out of committee, but hopefully it will. Last session there was a bill that he did move out of committee. And on the Senate side, Senator Fontana, also with bipartisan support, has Senate Bill 512, also in the, so it's in the Senate Finance Committee. So we're looking for co-sponsors, and we're looking for pressure for urging them to move it out of committee and get a vote on this thing. It could be done with the budget. It would make sense for it to be done with the budget because it does impact the revenue. And that there are vehicles, particularly if the General Assembly decides to raise revenue in one form or another, there would be a bill to drop this into. But that's not a sure thing, and advocacy now is really important. So I'd like to take your questions on that, and also hear if there's anyone on the phone who has used NAP. And the last thing is to tell you there is a statewide coalition forming, expanding, and there are monthly calls that are actually not sponsored by the Housing Alliance, but by a group in Pittsburgh. But we are a part of it. The Housing Alliance is a part. Several other groups from around the state are joining in, and we really encourage people to participate. So, *7 to unmute your line. Questions about NAP, comments, experiences with the program? I'd love to hear that. Anybody? Okay. Well, we will certainly keep you posted on that.
Cindy?
Yes, go ahead.
This is David. Are there any other provisions in those bills besides like a straightforward expansion of it, in terms of dedicated uses, or are we just focused on seeking the additional funding, which obviously is probably the most important thing?
That's a good question, David, because there have been multiple bills in the past which sought smaller increases and dedicating the money. I know Representative Dean had a bill to increase it by $3 million dedicated to housing for vulnerable populations or homeless veterans or something like that. The decision was made that the way to build the greatest support for this was not to dedicate money, but simply to expand it by $18 million. And so both bills are very simple. They delete $18 million and stick in $36 million.
Thank you.
Other questions? Okay. I think the time has come for me to say that I have thoroughly enjoyed doing this. If those of you who may not have seen the numerous the emails that have gone out, this is my last call with the Housing Alliance. I will stay in the field of community development, but I am moving on, and so I may get on the calls as a participant. And but I know that you'll be in good hands, and we will certainly be continuing the calls, and we'll talk to you in a month. So thank you. If nobody else has any comments, again, *7, we'll talk with you in May. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.